They were looking back at me. Written by user Scumbag Redditor on the NoSleep section of Reddit. I don't tell people this story much. I'm just typing it out because my therapist suggested it. Hey, couldn't hurt, right? He doesn't believe me anyway. It'll be nice to have someone hear the story and not immediately dismiss it out of hand as bullshit. Or maybe you guys will too. I suppose I don't really care anymore. Anyway, this all started when 3 friends, Alex, Paul, and Chris and I were in the woods behind Paul's house, sneaking cigarettes. We were all 15 except for Alex, who was 14 and lived on Chris's street. We had just started smoking, thanks to Chris, who was far more rebellious than the 3 of us. Plus, his dad smoked. So we'd started hanging out at Paul's house more and foraging further and further into the woods to find a good spot to stand around, smoke cigarettes, and feel cool. That afternoon, we'd found a narrow path and followed it for a good 15 minutes or so. Eventually, we saw a little shack in the distance, silhouetted against the setting sun. We walked around it and could tell it was in disrepair. The roof was sagging and the window next to the door was missing 3 of its 4 panels. "Paul, have you ever been back here and seen that?" Chris asked, stepping forward and ducking under a branch to get a better view at the house. "Nope." Paul stuck his cigarette in his mouth and leaned against the tree. "We don't own these woods, and no one ever comes back here because none of my neighbors wants the duty of keeping the path clear." "It's probably a storage shed," I offered. We got closer and could see that the set of steps up to the front door looked rotten and unstable. "Oh shit!" Alex was the first to notice a large dark stain on the small square of porch in front of the door. I'm almost positive that's blood, you guys." We all stopped walking and looked. It certainly looked like blood. I glanced at the others and I could tell from the looks on Alex and Paul's faces that they weren't too keen on going forward. "Fuck, let's check it out," Chris said, tossing his cigarette aside and putting his hand on the wooden stair railing to the right of the steps. He looked back expectantly when none of us followed him. "I don't know," Paul said dubiously. "I don't want to trespass, especially not in some murder scene. That blood looks pretty fresh." "It's probably from an animal or something." Chris looked at me, then Alex. "Really? None of you guys want to check it out?" "You guys are such fags." "Come on, Chris, it's getting dark anyway." I didn't want to seem like a pussy, but I also didn't want to go into the house. It was probably just an animal's blood, but still, who knows? There could be some crazy person living in there or something. I cast a nervous glance at the horizon, noting that the sun was almost gone. "You can say if you want, man. I gotta get home before my parents get pissed." Chris swore at us again, calling us girls and faggots, but eventually seeing that we weren't gonna change our mind. All during the walk home, he kept making fun of us. When we parted ways, though, that was the last I thought of the shack in the woods for some time. The next week, Chris started to act a little odd. It wasn't noticeable at the time, but a couple of the things he did were off-putting. He'd spend more time relaxing on the grass in front of the school by himself, smoking a cigarette and watching people walk. Except the way he did it was creepy. He'd just turn his head and follow their movement until they were gone. Far from normal high schooler awkward, this constant staring seemed almost predatory. Another time we were smoking behind the school. We were all trying to keep up with Chris's new pace so he wouldn't make fun of us for being babies, and a frog hopped along. Chris bent down and scooped it up, stared at it for a few seconds, then put the cigarette out on the frog's back. Actually, the frog's skin seemed pretty wet, so it didn't seem that badly hurt, but it did squirm around a lot. "Chris, what the hell?" Alex looked disturbed. He was a fairly sweet kid, and this kind of casual sadism didn't go well with his personality. "Stop torturing it, man!" Chris looked up and he had a gleam in his eye I hadn't ever seen there before. "What? This bothers you guys?" He looked down at the frog as if he'd already forgotten he was holding it, stroked it absent-mindedly twice, then without warning wound up and hurled it into the brick wall 10 feet away. The frog hit the wall with a splat and we all turned away in disgust. "What the fuck, Chris?" Paul looked pissed. "You're gonna start kidnapping stray cats now or something?" Chris just laughed, flicked his cigarette away, and walked back towards the school. We exchanged uneasy looks. The next weekend we stayed the night at Chris's house because his parents were out of town. Chris had snuck half a bottle of rum and a third of a bottle of vodka from his parents' liquor shelf, and we were all kind of tipsy. We sat on the couches and talked about girls for a while, but Chris started getting quiet. For 5 minutes he didn't say anything at all, then he got up without warning and walked to the window, looked out, and then turned back to us. "Hey, do you guys want to see what I snagged from that house?" "I didn't even see you go inside," Paul said. Chris waved a hand dismissively. "Not with you guys. I went back the next day. You wouldn't believe how much is in that house. Not just in terms of stuff either. There's knowledge inside that house, man." "What?" I looked over at Paul, who gave me a wary glance. "Chris, what the fuck are you talking about?" He turned around and faced us full on. "It'll be easier if I just show you guys. It's up in my room. One at a time, though." His eyes lingered over all three of our faces before settling on Alex. "You first." He turned and walked out of the room without waiting, and we could hear his footsteps going up the stairs. We all exchanged nervous glances. "Alex, we can come with you, dude," Paul said, setting his cup on the counter and looking worried. Alex took a swig from his cup and shook his head. "Nah, man, no need. I'm set." He didn't look all that worried, but he did look a bit drunk. It's probably nothing anyway. He walked out of the room a little unsteadily. We heard him go up the stairs and heard the door to Paul's room open. There was a pause of about 20 seconds, then a high-pitched scream. We heard running footfalls descend the stairs, and then the sound of the front door bursting open. Paul and I looked at each other, panicking, then followed. We saw Alex's back disappearing up the street. "Alex!" I yelled. Alex stopped running maybe 75 yards away and threw up all over the sidewalk. He straightened up, wiped his mouth, and kept running. "What the fuck?" Paul and I turned around and jumped to see that Chris was waiting in the doorway. "What the fuck did you do to him?" I asked, fists clenching. Chris laughed and crossed his arms. "He was drunk, dude. He kept weaving and took a good 5 seconds to react to what I showed him. If he was sober, he wouldn't have flipped like that, I bet. It's not that cool." "What the hell was it?" Alex wasn't super brave, sure, but then again, not even wimps throw up from a scary sight. I was definitely weirded out. Chris stared at me for about 10 seconds. "See for yourself." He turned and walked back up the stairs. I turned to Paul. "Seriously, what the fuck?" He looked worried. "I'm gonna go check on Alex. Dude, just go home. Fuck whatever he found. This is fucking weird. Seriously, man, don't feel some bullshit need to find out what it was. I'd get far away if I was you." I nodded and he took off up the street after Alex. I looked up towards the top of the stairs. If I was sober, I might have gone home. But I was curious too, and Alex was kind of a wimp. I went back into the kitchen, opened the tools drawer under the sink, and stuck the buck knife that belonged to Chris's dad in my pocket. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I wasn't going up there empty-handed in case Chris flipped on me. Fingers wrapped around the buck knife in my pocket, I went up the stairs and pushed the door to Chris's room open. The light was off, and Chris was standing over by his desk, hard to make out in the gloom. I cautiously moved across the floor, gripping the buck knife harder. "You want to see it?" He had some kind of box in his hands. I edged a little closer, cautiously, nodded once. He took the lid off of it just a crack. I bent closer and went to take a look. I only got a brief glimpse before Chris shut the box suddenly, but I straightened up fast. "Fuck, Chris!" "Did you see it?" he demanded. "Not enough to get a good look. Chris, were those eyes?" I'd seen them looking back at me. I was sure of it. Human-sized eyes, white bloody spheres the size of golf balls. "Chris, are those real?" "Don't worry about it. Just get out." Chris put the box back on his desk and started pushing me towards the door. I didn't resist. "Chris, what the fuck? What's going on?" "Just go home. I messed up. I gotta go check on Alex." He started moving down the stairs ahead of me, walked into the kitchen. I stood near the front door, hesitant. "Chris..." I didn't know what to say. "Just go. It'll be fine." I went. I didn't know what to do. I walked home, a solid 20-minute walk, looking over my shoulder the whole way. My parents were still at a movie. I was freaked out. I went up to my dad's office and booted up his computer, deciding to see if there'd been anything in the news about the shack or recent disappearances. I debated calling my parents, but I was sure I still smelled like alcohol and decided against it. I remembered how the two pupils in the box had stared up at me. They had certainly seemed real. What the hell had Chris found in that shack? About 20 minutes later, I hadn't found anything, but a movement outside the window made me whip my head around nervously. I looked out the window and saw a figure on the other side of the road outside my house. It wasn't moving and appeared to be looking up and down the street. I was paranoid before, but now I was a wreck. I turned off the light in my dad's office and snuck back to my room, grabbed a baseball bat and came back in time to see the figure approaching the porch. As he moved towards the light, I could see it was Chris. I relaxed a little and was about to go downstairs to open the door when he moved further into the porch light. His shirt and pants were covered in dripping red. At first I thought he'd been hurt, but I remembered the way he'd taken his time crossing to my house, casing the neighborhood first. Not the actions of someone who needs help. My heart started beating fast in my chest. Chris raised his hand and the light glinted off something silver. At first I thought it was a knife and my breath caught, but then I saw it was just a spoon. He tapped on the door with it 3 times. As he did so, I could see that his shirt was clearly streaked with blood. Fuck! I skittered down the stairs on my hands and knees, desperately hoping to be able to lock the door before he tried the knob. I tried to stay quiet as I crawled like a spider on all fours to the door, dropping the bat in the process, but when I reached toward the latch, I heard more tapping on the other side, and I almost shit myself. I recovered and flipped the lock. I then moved to the back of the kitchen, trying to stay in the shadows, and peeked out the windows. Chris's head was swiveling, appraising the empty house. His eyes raked over the window and then stopped. We made eye contact for a brief, horrifying second. Then he lunged forward and tried the doorknob. Upon realizing it was locked, he turned and sprinted away. My house had 2 other doors. I ran to the glass sliding door at the back of the kitchen and turned the lock, a second before Chris came around the side and crashed into it. He reared back and we locked eyes again. He looked terrifying. His lips were twisted up in a snarl, and his eyes were wide open and staring. He punched the glass door, but the glass was thick and didn't break. He snarled and raced toward the other side of the house, but I beat him to it, turned the latch, then slid against the door, unable to look out and face that monster again. I heard him walk away and knew he was prowling around the outside of the house. I prayed my parents hadn't left any windows open, but the weather was still nice. I was sure they had. I was dead. My last few seconds on Earth, and all I could do was close my eyes and crouch against the door. The sounds of tires squealing jolted me from my stupor. Lights flashed against the kitchen wall. A car was pulling into the driveway. My parents were home. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen window, praying that Chris wouldn't hurt them. It wasn't my parents. The car door opened and a man barreled out. He tackled Chris to the ground, sending the bloody spoon flying. The man pulled a pistol from the small of his back and jammed it into Chris's face. I recognized him as Alex's dad, the ex-Marine. He was screaming as he pushed the pistol harder and harder into Chris's cheek. He didn't say much before the gunshot drowned out his words, but I'll never forget what he yelled. "My son's eyes! What did you do with my son's eyes?"